welcome to the Give Show. My guest today is Neil Gabbie. Some interesting stuff I saw over the past couple of days in the media was the ECB have increased interest rates by 75 basis points. At the same time, inflation is at a stubborn height of over 10% in the European Union. Neil, can you give us some ideas as to why we have inflation in Europe, the United Kingdom, and the Western world in general?
Sure, John. Thanks for having me on the show again. I'm really glad to be back.
Very
And the
well.
first thing I should say is that I'm not an economist, but I do have an interest in what's going on in the economy. And it's very clear that we are in the grip of some large economic forces that are happening. So as we were talking about just before, what's happened in the world, across the world in the last couple of years, is that let me rewind. If we think about the economy and we think about what's happening in the economy, what's happened when we spend money is we are exchanging value. So this is all about value. So value is created, and then participants in the economy, use money to exchange that in exchange for value.
True.
So we have an economy that is a flow of money and a flow of value going around and around. So what's happened in the last couple of years is that the governments and the banks have created a whole load of money. They've printed money and created money in the economy without there being any value created, because lots of people were unable to work and we had all the furlough payments and all that kind of thing. So when all that money is created so that these people can survive and able to buy food and pay their rent, but without those people being productive, creating any value, then in my mind, that money has nowhere to go apart from into the prices of everything that already exists. And that is why when that flows through the economy, and it can take months and months and months for that to happen, as it's starting to come through now, that is why we are seeing this upward pressure on prices in the economy. Effectively, people have got all this money and there's no new production in the economy for that to be spent on. So it's being spent. So the prices and the existing value that is there is forcing the prices to go up. So that's how I imagine the inflation to be coming into the economy, because of all the quantitative easing, the printing of money, the giving of benefits, the creation of what they call stimulus payments in the US. All that activity has created money into the economy without there being any value created, and so that money has to go into prices. I give a very simple example that I can give you that will explain. This is how I explain it to my children, who are kind of teenagers, so they understand things but not everything. If you have an economy where there exists just 10 apples and €100, that's the entire economy, then when that balances out, every apple is worth €10, and that's fine. If the farmer grows another apple, then we have 11 apples, and then the bank should print another €10 of money, so we have €110 in order to maintain the balance in the economy, and then every apple is still worth 10. However, if the bank decides to print that extra €10 of money, so we've got €110, but we only have 10 apples still because we haven't produced anything more, then all of a sudden, to make the economy balance, all those apples have got to be worth 11 each. And there's your 10% inflation that's just happened because of the printing money. So that's the simple example that I give to my kids to explain how printing more money without creating any more value creates inflation. Yeah. Does that make sense?
That's a great example there, Neil. Thank you for that. And I know what you're saying there is that during the COVID pandemic, governments borrowed money left, right, and centre and put it back into the economy to keep people and the economy afloat. But the productive economy was no greater, effectively. And that's contributing to inflation in the Western world as we see it at the moment. But not just in the Western world. There's major inflationary issues in places like Turkey, for example.
It's all the same thing where the economies were forced to be stagnant for a bit, but we had to help people to survive.
Yeah. Also, of course, other contributing factors are these COVID lockdowns in China that are hitting the Chinese economy, and it's also contributing to supply chain issues right throughout the world, because, of course, China is one of the major manufacturing centers in the world now, as we know.
And when you talk about those supply chain issues, again, with my background, those are kind of microeconomic effects. So in my mind, they will have short-term impacts on pricing for sure, but the overall long-term macroeconomic effects of the quantitative easing, the borrowing, the increase in borrowing, that's the real unstoppable force. Theoretically, once those supply chain problems ease, then that should force prices to come down if those suppliers are willing to follow that process.
Yeah. There's actually a very interesting article there some weeks ago on the Sunday Times business section, the Irish edition of it, that is, where Cormac Lucy was talking about the fact that the central banks and government policy, they created a lot of this inflationary momentum during the COVID-19 pandemic period, as you've mentioned there just a minute or two ago. And what happened at one stage was money supply was far greater in terms of its growth than growth in productivity. And that exactly is the point you're making. And
exactly,
now, for example, the Federal Reserve Board, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, they're all having to increase interest rates to try and put a brake on inflation in their economies. So what we're going to see is probably over the next couple of quarters is probably substantial increases in interest rates to try and kill off inflation by having a recession in most economies in the developed world, in the G7 in particular. So there's a lot to be played out yet, I think, before.
Absolutely. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not an economist, so that's where my understanding starts to fade a little bit. And the way the impact of interest rates rising, I don't really understand the mechanics of how that then will help to manage inflation. I understand that makes borrowing more expensive, and so that might make investment slow down. So these are the areas where things start to get a little bit murky for me as to how that is going to happen. And I leave that to the Sunday Times business papers to explain that to people.
Of course, it's a very interesting read in any event. And last week, or the past couple of weeks anyway, technology stocks have taken a battering, I should say. There's been nearly $1 trillion written off the value of technology stocks. So you're going to see a situation maybe next year where CEOs are going to, of these technology companies, they're going to say, I need savings to increase or to improve the share price. They're going to start looking at headcount reductions, for example, or the need to increase productivity within those organizations. So I think it's going to be a rough enough ride now for the next 2 or 3.
Yeah, you can absolutely see how all these massive pressures that are coming, and we can see them coming down the line, are going to have real world impacts for people and jobs and the economies as a whole. And like you say, if that results in a recession whereby the actual value of the economy actually shrinks for a period of time, you can see how that might happen, and then how that then plays out, how long it lasts, that's anyone's guess.
True. And if you just take an example there where Intel on a worldwide basis are talking about headcount reductions. So they have a number of manufacturing sites throughout the world. If you reduce headcount in any of those manufacturing sites, it's going to impact the local economy. So you're going to see a reduced demand for hotel, catering, restaurants, leisure activities. So it's going to feed right through into smaller businesses in local economies. So it's going to impact people quite a bit if there's headcount reductions, in those big organizations, to try and improve productivity and to get share prices back up again.
Sure. So what we've been talking about here looks quite gloomy, but I'm always trying to look on the positive side of things. So I would be looking to advise people and say, well, how do we deal with what's coming down the line, and how would both employees and business people try to address this? And because we've gone through a period where productivity has been suppressed in a certain way. So what I would be encouraging people to do is to try and trying to ramp up the productivity, either their personal productivity or the productivity of their business, and in order to try and counter those forces that might be trying to suppress that productivity. One thing that we know when we're in an inflationary environment is that money in the bank is losing value basically as you sleep. So if there are opportunities to be able to invest any of that money in order to increase productivity, then now would be the time to be doing that and trying to generate as much value as possible out of the assets that you have, whether that's your personal productivity or the productivity of your business. If you can increase the value that is being created, then that is going to start to help to rebalance the imbalance that we've got. So the encouragement and the optimistic outlook that I would have would be to continue to produce, to continue to be creative, to continue to use your assets and your abilities the best that you can in order to create value in the economy. And that is how we can maybe prevent and certainly recover from recession as quickly as possible.
That's a very good point. I think if you just take the example of manufacturing industry, you could always invest in new equipment that's going to make your business more productive or increase output to meet, demand of your prospects and your clients. In the case of a service business, for example, you might decide to invest in a rebranding exercise or developing intellectual property that's going to generate leads for you down the line. In the case of a householder, you might decide to cut back on discretionary expenditure, but at the same time, you might decide to pay capital off your mortgage. They're all good examples of
those are really good examples, John. I think the thing that struck me as you were saying those things are those kinds of decisions in the light of what we think is coming down the line. Those would have to be very courageous decisions to make. In order to make those decisions, I think that what we need as a society and as an economy is that courage to be able to make those decisions, and that is how we will survive and thrive through what might be coming down the line. I think the idea of using courage, making brave decisions is going to be critical in that, and that's by business leaders, by householders alike.
Yeah, I think this has been an amazing conversation today, Neil, and you explained, to the layman in very good terms how inflation gets into an economy when you have quantitative easing and printing of money, but you don't necessarily have an increase in productivity to balance it out. And then you've given some very good advice to people in service industry, manufacturing industry, and the homeowner, and also the vulnerable in our society. Have a positive mindset. Don't panic. If you can invest in improving your productivity in the workplace, or for example, in terms of paying capital off your mortgage, then you're going a long way to stabilizing your, balance sheet, I suppose you could say, whether it's your personal balance sheet or a business balance sheet.
Exactly.
And then governments will have the scope then to look after the vulnerable in our society, through, having budgets. They might have to tax the working person slightly more, for example, but at the same time, there's money available then to look after the vulnerable in our society. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the audience before I let you go?
No, just to say, John, that thank you for inviting me to come onto this show. And what you're doing here in creating these shows is that idea of creating value, being courageous, and doing this kind of activity, which the value that we create, hopefully someone will pick up on this and be able to make some different decisions in the future that will help them and help their families and help their businesses to thrive through what's probably going to be a tough time. And as a leadership coach, this is one of the things that I would be talking about with my clients if they come to me with concerns about the future, to talk about courage, to talk about positivity, to talk about optimism and humility, and what steps can actually be taken practically in order to thrive during this time. So that's why this has been a really useful exercise for me to be able to say some of those things out loud to yourself and to your audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your kind words today, Neil, and for your input. And of course, we host the gift show to give people, whether it's the working person, the business person, or the vulnerable in our society, practical tips as to how they can cope during this inflationary period. And I think, as you say there, it's about having a positive mindset and to look into the future and try to invest in the productive economy in your business. So on that note, I shall bring today's conversation to a close. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, John.
Most welcome.